And one of the academics asked me, "Oh, so do you support ISIS?" I was like, "What?" Like, it was crazy that that question could be pitched, but also crazy that you can think that we would associate with something so horrific, like which kind of really took me back.
So welcome to the RJV Show. Today's episode is with Dr. Abida Malik. If you like the episodes, please like and subscribe. Help us to spread the podcast as wide and far as possible, and try to get discussions and topics going. Anything that you see in the podcast that you want to discuss, please put a comment in the section below. Today we're discussing a number of topics. Dr. Malik is currently an associate teaching Understanding Contemporary Society at the University of Nottingham. Her PhD explored British Muslim civic organizations in the UK and looked at stigma, performance and identity. Inshallah, we'll be unpacking all of this stuff. She has written both academic and policy papers on British Muslim identities, Islamophobia, Muslim organizations, and many, many more topics which we'll hope to discuss in a bit. She's also fluent in, I'm always delighted to hear that people are fluent in multiple languages. She's fluent in Punjabi and comprehends German, Hindi and Urdu, and obviously English. So it's always a good start to have someone who can, especially when you go on holiday and you speak the language of the people, they always get happy. So that's a good place to start with. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Malik.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the invite, Reza.
So I reached out to you because, first of all, of your eloquence on a show that I saw before. And then when I looked at the papers that you've published and you've written, as myself, I'm doing a PhD. I always find that people who are actually writing and putting ideas pen to paper, and obviously you're involved in policy as well as just journals and articles and essays and so forth, I always find that interesting, and I would like to have discussions, dialogue, first and foremost for myself to learn from, and then hopefully the viewers or someone else who's looking at the podcast or listening to the podcast can take from. Let's jump in straight into a few topics that I really find interesting, especially as a Muslim who lives in the UK. I've been here myself just over 30 years, but I think you have a better understanding of the history of the Muslim identity and Muslim population in the UK. Can you discuss with us a little bit how far back we're going when we discuss the history of Muslims in the UK?
So I'm what is considered a second generation Muslim, British Muslim. So my family has quite a complex history of migration and diaspora which occurred for them. So with my mum, her family were refugees during the partition. So when the British Empire were in India, they had been involved in the partition. And so my family, who were from the Indian Punjab side, had to move over to the Punjab side of Pakistan. But essentially what happened was that my granddad moved to Kenya and Nairobi. So my family and my mum grew up there. So they actually speak Swahili. So that's another language to add. So then they already had this, because of the Commonwealth and citizenship status, they had the citizenship which belonged to the UK. So it came in the early 60s. To England and lived in London. So that's how kind of migration worked for them, and then eventually they settled in Nottingham, and that's where we grew up, and we were born and brought up in Nottingham essentially. And going back, like, you can look at it at a historical level, you can date back Muslims in the UK early 16th century, and then later then, within the 18th, you start to see the lots of Yemeni men coming over towards the port of Liverpool. So it was trade and business that was occurring there. And then what we have as well is the significance of Abdullah Quilliam, who became a Muslim converted. And then one of the first mosques, there was the Shah Jahan one, and then there was the one in Liverpool that was run by Abdullah Quilliam. So you had that history going on. Then you kind of fast forward a little, you had the 1960s.
So what period was Quilliam from, roughly?
So about 1889, around.
So would that be around Victorian kind of, or late Victorian?
Yes, the
Okay.
Victorian period.
Because Queen Victoria also had a friendship with a Muslim, I think, servant that she had who'd come from India. So it wasn't completely alien to the kind of monarchy of the country. Was the idea of Muslims and Islam?
Yeah, definitely. So aristocracy, and also the links that were to do with the influence and the colonizing of India. You had those trade links, and also there was an understanding of people migrating, even in the context of coming as servants to the monarchy. So that did occur. So then you have the 1960s, and in that time you have lots of migration occurring towards the UK. And those who are part of the Commonwealth. And in that time, you'll notice in the 60s and then into the 70s, a lot of racism occurring based on people's ethnicity. And so this is racism, and there was a lot of groups that came that were very aggressive and hostile towards people of different ethnicities. So there's a really famous speech which was done by a Conservative MP. You might recall it. It's Rivers of Blood speech by Enoch Powell, which was hugely divisive, and the impact that had.
So at that time, he was within the cabinet of the government, or
1970s, yes.
Okay, so he wasn't like a fringe party member or a fringe member of parliament. He was actually within the government of the United Kingdom.
So, and this hostility was found everywhere. So racism was in schools, in government, in education system, but also just how people were interacting in the everyday. So you have then the rise of things such as the skinheads, which came about, which were actively going and beating up people who are of different ethnicities, Asian and black. And it didn't matter what religion you were, it was just that you were different and you were the other and you were alien, and therefore it legitimized their kind of white supremacy, and the way of conducting themselves was hugely in a way of having hierarchy and dominance over minority groups.
So there seems to be a pattern between anti-Muslim and racist. Is that how you're describing that? They were kind of interwoven and intersectional, in the sense that the skinheads, it wasn't just against, for example, Asian Muslims, it was also against Caribbeans or Africans as well. Is that how it was?
It did not matter. So prejudice, discrimination was occurring to all those who are different. You can see it even, your background is in kind of media, and looking at programs of the past, the 1970s, they were inherently racist. The discourse and the narratives were just acceptable, and they were funny to make fun of those who were different. Yeah. So then you get to the 1980s, and in the 80s what had occurred was more of a move towards seeing black and minority groups who were Asian as well as one cohort. So these minorities who were struggling to kind of show their forms of identity and citizenship. So they became involved in community-led projects and community groups, started to set up their own organizations, and were able to access state funding and support for initiatives that they were doing within the UK. So this was all in the time of the 80s, 90s as well. You'd start to see more of a prominence of more, let's say, black academics and politicians that started to come very slowly into the fore. But then very much what happened in the 1990s, then you move to the 1990s and you see the tragic death of Stephen Lawrence, which exposed so many different layers of both racism from citizens, but also institutionally led racism within the police force that impacted many, and it still does, in terms of the inquiry that occurred and the recommendations which were made from that. So then you get to the 2000s, and then you have lots of different individuals, all having different identities and different backgrounds, and religiously identifying themselves within their groups. So the community groups, their organizations. So you have lots of work pre kind of 90s and 80s. You had Muslim civic organizations start to grow. And so some of the prominent ones we know of are like Muslim Council of Britain. And then you get to the 2000s, and then obviously what occurred in the 2000s was things like 9/11, 7/7, and the impact of those were huge. And then you had the Iraq War, which came as a result of 9/11. And underpinning all of this is changes in government and changes in the way they were responding to issues to do with issues around attacks and feeling a threat externally and internally. And so you saw tighter measures starting to occur. So with Labour, you saw the impact of the prevent strategy and contest strategy come about, and which was heavily focused on securitarisation of within the UK setting and externally as well. So you have British Muslims who start to identify, who are second or third generation, as being British. But then what occurred was a lot of resistance with regards to show us your loyalty. So this idea of where does your citizenship belong? Are you Muslim first, or are you British first? Are you Pakistani first? Are you Bangladeshi first? Are you? And all these questions were being posed for British Muslims to continuously reassert their identities and to say where essentially their loyalties lay. But this is really complex, as we know, because we all have multiple identities, and that shape and make us who we are, and we associate to some communities and not to other communities. But that doesn't mean the distinguishing fact is that it didn't mean that you're not British. So many people who previous generations, so the first generation possibly, understood the notion of belonging to the UK and always perceived it as the host nation. So they always saw this idea of potentially returning back to where they originally had come from. Then you fast forward to second and third generation Muslims who very much feel part of this society, who have cultural references and frameworks which they feel that they identify with, and feel that they have a place and a say towards the idea of what it means to be British. So there were lots of questions being asked around what is Britishness, and there was also a report put together which basically was identifying the Oldham riots, and Trevor Phillips saying that you had communities now sleepwalking into segregation. So essentially, what you had before was ideas and notions of multiculturalism. So people coming together of different cultures, and this what was defined as British kind of identity or national identity. But then there became a change and a move away from this idea of multiculturalism completely, and saying that it had failed. So you get to the 2011s, and then you have the coalition government, the Lib Dem Conservative government, who continued on with particular rhetoric to do with anti-terror legislation, and what it did was it stigmatized British Muslim communities because they were being associated to things which were done in the name of Islam. But then many started to kind of reassert their understanding and say, well, you know, why am I having to speak on behalf of those who have done such acts when they have nothing to do with me? So they essentially, what happened within the media and what you notice within politics was British Muslim civic actors and organizations were constantly called out to kind of be spokesperson for the rest of the Muslim communities. And yourself and I know that that's impossible to have representatives and one spokesperson for a whole community, because they're so varied and differ and diverse and so vast. in terms of their identities. Even yourself and I, we talk right now, we share differences and different experiences which shape who we are and how we identify to being British. So you get to then now, and we're at this point where we have a conservative left government. You have the rise of the far right. You have Britain First that came about. You had EDL. You have, transnational politics, which is also influential in how
Independence
people perceive
Party,
British Muslims.
Brexit Party, Independence Party.
Yeah, Brexit, like the impact of those parties have had, are huge in terms of providing a particular narrative. And it's begun to demonize and kind of single out communities as a way to kind of target and deflect from the real issues. So real issues of poverty or where resources should lie. So it's a way of dividing communities rather than bringing them together. And what essentially you notice now and what's occurring is you have British Muslims now coming together with others who are minorities, who have a shared collective experience in terms of discrimination, prejudice, racism, and they're kind of uniting with their concerns in their, whether it's in a job setting, in the health sector, education, and are trying to kind of create mobilization and activism from below up to have that impact.
Is that the organizational or Muslim organizations and the role that they're playing in the UK?
Organizational, from you have your religiously based groups, but also from a national perspective. If you see for the last couple of years, the National Union of Students had Muslim female presidents, which is huge. And it says so much about our youth and what they're achieving and how they're bringing people together with shared concerns and hoping that, it's addressed in a way which will hopefully ultimately have a good impact. So there is still hope. I mean, it's difficult because it's really hard to be in an environment where your current prime minister refers to Muslim women as letterboxes and bank robbers and essentially vilifies and stereotypes Muslims as the other, the alien, the one that needs to be excluded and marginalized, and hasn't been challenged. I mean, you look at the Conservative Party, and now also you saw reference to what was happening within the Labour Party. There's been no cause in terms of from within parties to say, right, we need to do an investigation. This is outrageous that we have noted Islamophobia occurring to the extent it does, and we need to address it. So yeah, I've given you a really long answer there and gone from the past to now, but yeah.
So we've covered a lot of area which we're going to dive into and try and expand and open up a little bit more. If we can go back to, you said the 15th century, so you said the 18th century there were Yemeni tradesmen coming to Liverpool and the major ports for trade and so forth. The 16th century, what was the what kind of Muslims, or what were they, where were they coming from, and what were they doing in the UK? Were they ambassadors? Were they tradespeople?
I think it was down to do migration with regards to business, and that was the main and underlying principles of it. So people were not necessarily distinguished from being the other as such in that way. So I think it's complex. I think the way it was done also was where Britain as an empire had relations and contacts, and therefore how they link together. So even if you look on the level of why do so many people associate Muslims as just being Asian, because many Muslims came from South Asia and migrated to the UK, but that's not to say that all Muslims are Asian. You have a vast majority, and you're seeing that diaspora now occur. But it was very much more focused in early periods, and then we've seen a shift now.
So those Muslims, did they end up staying or did they go back for after they finished their trade?
Yeah, so it wasn't necessarily that there were settled communities. I think the first time settled communities was used as a term was a lot later with regards to, you got the 1960s and 80s, and this was now a time where you'd see the formation of these communities. And I think it was more permanent because based on ideas and notions of citizenship. So you have, for example, having a British passport gave a certain level of kind of status to be and in a sense belong to the nation. But having said that, you've seen with regards to the Windrush scandal that's happened, and these people were assumed to be part of the Commonwealth, who were here and were British and have always considered themselves to be. But what's happened and the hostile policies which have occurred has meant that people of all different backgrounds are questioning their sense of belonging, and where they actually then do belong. I mean, even if you look at kind of legal aspects in terms of English law, if you're writing a will, for example, if your previous descent of your parents was from, like, say, mine from India, that is considered your kind of first hand of citizenship, and secondly, then you're British, which was fascinating. I never kind of knew that.
So can you unpack that for us?
So if you are from, like, if your parents are from a different nation, and then you become
British,
a British citizen, you are still associated to your place of descent. So essentially, in English law, if your parents are from India, for example, like mine, then that's essentially your home. So if there's things to do with land and property, that would be associated back to home, rather than this being your home as a second generation Muslim, and you're not a migrant. So I was fascinated by that, and I was like, oh, I'd like to delve deeper, looking at things legally and looking at history of law and how it comes about, and what is the status of those whose families have migrated, and how are they considered fully British.
So even if they have a British citizenship, the passport, naturalization, or even if they are born here, if their parents are not from the British Isles, there's a sense of almost otherness, isn't it? There's a sense of you are British, but you're also not necessarily fully British.
Yeah. And then when you, like, I remember, because I was looking at and writing a will for myself, I was really interested at this, because I thought, okay, and I was asking the solicitor, like, how does this work? And he was saying that it's really old English law, and there's lots of legal frameworks that when you revisit them, there's so much that needs to be done. Like earlier, just before we went on to this podcast, talking about Islamophobia and the framework in terms of redefining it. And legally, there isn't a definition, and that's why there's been such a push for it to have, instead of crimes that are specifically aimed and targeted at Muslims to come under hate crime, as it currently does, there should be something that shows and selectively identifies it as being Islamophobic, so anti-Muslim racism based on your background and your being Muslim, essentially. So there's a lot of work around this. So when you talk about racism, there's this idea called racialization. So you are ascribing essentially identities to a group of people or individuals that they haven't ascribed themselves. So if you're referring to all Muslims, for example, are extremist terrorists, that's a form of racialization. So that's how the term anti-Muslim racism is used and applied. So there's lots of work that's done by the APPG on British Muslims, so the all parliamentary group, and they did a whole report and provided evidence to show that there needed to be an exploration of first a definition and many agree and disagree with it, which is fine. But then it's a starting point with regards to having this definition, and then somehow for it to be incorporated into a legal framework, similar to when you look at work around anti-Semitism and how the IHRA definition is put together. So it's really important that when you're looking at things and going back historically, you're getting a sense of how things have come about and where things are needing refining and need to be challenged. But it requires people of all different backgrounds. Like, so from my perspective, I'm a sociologist. You have people who are doctors and professionals who are challenging in their own field. Yourself, Reza, you're challenging within your field. You're questioning those the normalization and social norms that have been associated towards British Muslims and their identities, and how these have essentially become essentialized and where they need to be challenged.
So that's interesting. I didn't realize that, even if you're British, because I know like in the Roman Empire, if you were a slave or you were a citizen, if you become citizen, then you were a citizen. I'm sure there was nuances there as well. Same in America, if you are an alien, that means you're not American citizen, they call you alien. Once you become American citizen, it's like, fine, okay, you're American citizen, so you have many rights that a non-citizen has, so you're being accepted part of a society. Of course, even within these contexts and these countries and these societies, there is that level of, are you supportive of the hegemonic culture, the main ideology, or are you opposed to it? And even then, if you're a citizen, there's the challenge against you. But I didn't realize in England they go back to what your parents were. Depending on where your parents were born, you get what inheritance or not. So that's very interesting.
Check it out as well, because check it out for yourself and others, because if you look as well, there's actually regional differences. So if you're born in Ireland or you're born in Scotland, then things change in terms of legal frameworks around that.
Oh,
so
even Scotland, and it impacts if you live in England.
So say, for example, if you're Scottish and you're there are even different ways of how things are done in terms of how families are kind of associated towards dividing of wealth, whereas in England, the person who's the breadwinner, so the husband, is associated as the person who kind of carries more from even on a gender-based role. So yeah, have a look into it. I need to go back to it and actually get it done. I have not done it yet. So yeah.
That's pretty interesting. I want to also discuss with you. So we've kind of touched on the identities and the communities that formed over the last, I think mainly you've been saying over the last, from the 60s and 50s, 60s, 70s onwards, which has been Asian, or so it'd be Indian or Pakistani, Asian. And maybe from my studies, as Egypt was also a colony of Britain, at one point, a lot of Arab Egyptians, but not necessarily as much now. I think maybe since the kind of late 90s and early 2000s, more Iraqis have come over because of obviously the war in Iraq, two wars in Iraq. So that's a shift on the direction of where the identities of the communities are impacting on organizations set up, impacting on the politics, because each community may be vying for a certain kind of needs that they have. But even though they have certain, so for example, all communities want to be able to wear hijab without problem. All communities want to be able to have access to halal meat without problem, be able to have places of worship without problem. There are those kind of similarities that cross all of the Muslim communities.
I think what's interesting about those that you'd consider first generation, is that they did a lot of work in terms of functionally setting up things like prayer spaces and the practical aspects of faith. So they were integral in creating like the foundations for British Muslim communities going forward. Now what you see is definitely within the youth, the questioning and the challenging has varied and is becoming very different to kind of where they see their role, and becoming more prominent in the mainstream and wanting to take ownership of that much more. So yeah, that's definitely interesting there.
We've discussed how the population and its interaction with kind of like culture and citizenship, and the idea of what citizenship is, and is it as fixed as we really think? Because we're beginning to understand that there's kind of a lot of fluidity and flexibility in what either citizenship stands for or what British values stand for, because it sometimes is defined against something else. So if we see at the moment in UK politics, what British values are like defined as, it is against, for example, something that they are not. So either certain Muslim values, Muslim values, whatever, but certain values that are identified with Muslims, right? Can we discuss a little bit from your perspective how the minorities and majority British population view multiculturalism? So if you can discuss how Muslims, when I say Muslims, obviously we're talking about a broad segment, but in a general form, and on a general form from the other side, which is when I say British, I mean the kind of white, almost Anglo-Saxon citizens of the UK, not the ones who've migrated in the last 50, 60, 70 years.
With multiculturalism, and I think one of the things was when I was talking, kind of giving a historical overview, I was talking about how there was a presence of Muslims in the UK, and very much considered part of the society, in the sense that the perception from themselves, especially second and third generation, but and also kind of the politics that was happening at the time. So you had the Conservatives in the 70s, and then Labour moving 1990s and 2000s. But what's underpinned by all of those are different ideas, whether from a conservative angle, neoliberalism, or the multiculturalism model. Now, with multiculturalism, it came about as an idea which was very much citizens creating a sense of a niche of themselves, so understanding their own identities and what they required as citizens. So, for example, a Sikh man's right to wear his turban and not have to wear a helmet while he is on a motorbike, a Muslim woman's right to wear a hijab. So these were considered as, within multiculturalism, an environment which allowed for minorities to access certain things that were distinct to them based on their identities, and then also integrated it as part of their citizenship as well. So they said, as citizens, we should be allowed to do X, Y, and Z. So then in the 1990s, what happened and what was the kind of really key thing was obviously the satanic verses, so Salman Rushdie. So what you had was Muslims coming out and protesting, and very much identifying as a niche separate to previously, where minorities were joined together as being Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim, who were kind of Asians, or other backgrounds, minorities, Black, Arab, coming together on basis of ethnicity against the majority being white, British. But then what you had was now individuals and groups and organizations starting to distinguish themselves in terms of the offense caused and the blasphemy, which then created protests. And so then that made identifying that community as Muslim started to kind of, form shape. Then you had kind of the rise, and the group known as MCB came about at that sort of time. So then what you have in 2000 and kind of in the 2000s, 2001, 2007 time, was this whole idea of the death of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism has failed. It doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't worked. We've kind of been, and it's this argument about to what extent can you keep adhering to lots of different identity politics. So from a government state-led view, so funding became less and less for groups and organizations because there was a move away from the identity politics angle and more kind of like community groups and organizations kind of not necessarily reformulating themselves in that way, like trying to pitch for funding from.
Why do you think that was, that the government started to do that?
I think it's particular narrative. So you have, like, Muslim communities are heterogeneous, right? So you have this environment where there's a particular way of presenting particular narratives of Islam, and if you fit within those, then potentially you're more susceptible to kind of gaining funding and things. And if you were, again, it's this idea of being representative and spokesperson. So if you do particular kind of not having dissent, so not presenting a dissent in politics, so not challenging or critiquing, but rather conforming.
Was that like an aim of the government to try and pitch Muslim against Muslim to see who would be closer to what the government perceives as acceptable Muslim?
I think, I can't obviously speak on behalf of the government, but I think it's down to this idea of kind of that what's acceptable, what is the acceptable version of being Muslim and what's normalized. And it's to do with any organization, right? So if myself, yourself go out now to try to get funding for whatever project we're doing, whoever we gain that funding from will have a particular agenda and they're governed by that. So would want us to integrate that within to how we use that money and use that to kind of further a particular type of agenda. So you do have, there are negatives of kind of communities seeking funding, for example, because they are pitching each other and they're competing, and there's also resentfulness to one to another, and it creates lots of tensions anyway. So even if you look at non-Muslim working class communities have potentially have resentment towards Muslim communities who are getting funding where they feel like that money could have been spent elsewhere much better, for example. So it's a way of, it can create divisions as well. So you've seen a move, there was this move away from kind of organizations seeking funding, but also then a move away from this idea as a political model being multiculturalism. So then this idea came about that there's a death of multiculturalism, we need to get rid of it. And then you had, when David Cameron became Prime Minister, this notion of the big society. So the big society is based around like everyone looking out for each other from the bottom up approach. So communities and kind of building communities through that way, not necessarily being from a top down version, but that's obviously on a kind of neoliberalism agenda as well. So
is that when he came out with the Hug a Hoodie campaign?
so with that, then there was this, so even with Labour, they were moving towards community cohesion. So they'd said, right, multiculturalism hasn't worked, we're going to move towards community cohesion. Then the Lib Dem and Conservatives came into power, then it was big society, and then we've got to a point where as a political model it's just like, let's focus on neoliberalism as a way of being. And I think all communities are feeling the kind of disadvantage, the austerity which is occurring. And I think that's why now you see lots of people uniting. So even if you look on the school dinners, you have lots of Muslim, non-Muslim charities working together, organizations, restaurants, because there's this collective understanding of trying to support each other and be there for one another. So it's definitely shifted. There's been lots of arguments within sociology about kind of reinvigorating or saying that multiculturalism exists. So Tariq Madood is a huge person who is an advocate for multiculturalism and talks about its relevance, and it does exist. So when we live in particular communities and societies, we see it. There's others like Vertovic who've said that what we notice now is before there was migration and then people will come from one country into another, and that would occur. But now you have lots of people moving from one country to another and it going all over. So we're becoming more and more interconnected, this idea of a global village. So we're all really getting more and more kind of plural as societies. Then you have this other academic who's a sociologist called Ulrich Beck, and what he kind of pointed to, and it's a bit of a utopian kind of thinking, was like, we're all global citizens, so we're the citizens of the world now. So we're not necessarily just citizen based on national boundaries, and we're all cosmopolitan. And then he talks a lot about how we've become cosmopolitan in various ways, and that is something that we should all unite on. The whole similarity and commonality of being human, and that's the way forward. So these are ongoing debates within in kind of sociology circles, but also from a government perspective, there is, kind of work around what is the role of communities, how do they kind of interact and come together. And I think that's why work which is kind of oral and written submissions that are given time to time on various issues, be it on halal meat or kind of lack of diversity in employment for people, is discussed a lot. I think it's really important to kind of contribute where you can and give a voice as well. So to understand that there are many voices, there's not just one voice that defines Muslim communities, and that has to occur. So I think how majorities see it, it just depends where people stand politically, if they align to the left or the right, and also gender and also age differences. So you see generational differences. Many of the young British citizens within the UK didn't want Brexit, but the older generation did. So those differences occur, and the way people perceive notions of multiculturalism and their understandings of them also is based on their own interpretations and experiences that they've had.
It's interesting, this concept of multiculturalism, because the Quran almost mentions specifically to this topic, and it says, "O mankind, indeed we have created you from male and female and made you peoples and tribes, that you may know one each other indeed." So Allah, God in Islam, is encouraging people to interact, specifically saying, we're happy for you to be different tribes and different nations. You don't have to be all the same, and that's what we want for you, but we want for you to know each other, have respect for each other, tolerance for each other.
That's the beauty, I think, of Islam, and kind of what is missed on a lot of people, because when you essentialize identities and you perceive people to be just this one homogenous group, it's so troubling, because I think even for myself, when I was at university, I loved it. And it was so eye-opening because you had Muslims from across the world. And what brought us all together when we used to go, for example, to our prayer room, was the fact that we were Muslim. And languages, ethnicities, all kind of the cultural differences were there, but it made us more vibrant and kind of understanding of each other. So we had, lots of different friends and different backgrounds, and then when it meant going on holiday, you could go to see them all in different countries when they went back home.
But I think we don't help ourselves as minority Muslim from different parts of the world who live here sometimes by not interacting as Muslims with our own ethnicities, with the white British community. And a lot of people confuse assimilation with integration. You don't lose your identity to integrate. You will if you assimilate. So the whole point is, yes, I am, for example, Iranian or Pakistani or Indian and Muslim, but I'm also have the identity as a British citizen. And so you also, my fellow British citizen, we have a lot in common. We can talk about other than stuff in religion. There's humanity, there's the certain values in British citizenship that we allow others, so the government, to define for everyone, and we don't participate in that discussion to say most of the values you as British as a government are espousing as a British value is within Islam and Muslim and Pakistani or Iranian society.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. It's not exclusive. So but we don't allow that discussion. Obviously, media doesn't help. Organizations which are anti-Muslim don't help. But we need to try and I think work harder to try and overcome those barriers and get through the block. I wanted to discuss with you. Oh, sorry, carry on.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think like there is kind of change coming, and although it's slow, I think even like you have a lot of British white converts who are kind of, it's a rise, and essentially it's increasing within the UK. But also, like for myself, I went to a primary school. Like if I look at my own identity, how do I define it? Because I wasn't born in India or Pakistan, even though my mum is associated to being Pakistani, she's not because she was born in India, but because of a partition and a history that was interfered with there, that was also then the impact on her own identity. But then also then we have connections to Kenya now, and that my family also speak in like Swahili. And so then when I'm trying to describe and you fill out the ethnicity, really what are you? I'm like Asian other. I don't know. Like I don't know how to fill that out, because I'm like, I was born here and I went to Pakistan like once in my whole life, and that was it, and that was my connection. But then it's so tricky because I went to a primary school here, I went to a state secondary school, college, university, all here. So all the things that I relate to and all the friends I have are also different to one another. And I think when I got to university, I think it was really interesting that you had all these societies. So when you get to university, you'll have the Saudi society or the Algerian society. So everyone has their own kind of identities based on their nationalism. But what kind of attracted me the most was, there's like an Islamic society, and it's amazing because we're all different, but we're all coming together because we have the same faith and it's shared, and there's this collective experience that was occurring. So yeah, I think now as well, I think one of the things, and this relates back to some of the earlier points we've made, is to do with now what we see as well. There's recently a conference that was Black Muslim Renaissance, and I think a lot of discussions and debates are happening now with the Black Lives Matter movement and what happened in America, and it kind of crossing over here and giving the significance of internally and externally the role and experiences and places of Black British Muslims and how they identify within particular spaces and whether they feel included or excluded. And this is all these kind of fine, intricate debates, but people just will assume, right, you're all Muslim, so you're all in the same masjid together. But even within that, there's like, how do people belong? How do they feel part of a group? So yeah, there's lots to kind of think about.
That's an interesting discussion. I mean, the fact that you raised you're Muslims and some are from one country, some from another, it just kind of highlights the transcendent ability of Islam to bypass this modern 20th, 19th century concept of citizenship and concept of identity, with the identity concept that goes back 1,400 years to when Islam started, and the Holy Prophet said that the Muslims are one nation. So even if I am carrying a Iranian passport or an Algerian passport or a Pakistani passport, there's something that is above that makes me a brother and a sister to someone who's in the other part of the world who has that identity as Muslim. And when we see each other, we greet each other with as if there is no barrier.
Yeah. I wrote about that, actually. I wrote about this idea and this notion that we have of the global Ummah. And essentially, it's similar to this kind of cosmopolitan view of the human citizen. And so within the Ummah, we're connected and we see and perceive this kind of togetherness based on religion, but also being there for one another. And it runs deep and it's important. And I think sometimes when people kind of are trying to make associations about where your loyalties belong, well, they belong everywhere. They're not restricted to kind of my parents' place of birth or descent.
I think this discussion of a loyalty, does it happen with other minorities in the UK other than Muslims? So does it happen with someone who has a Jewish faith or a Catholic faith or a Buddhist faith? Or do you feel like when it's a person with a Muslim religious identity, that topic becomes more attached?
I think so. I think because there's been a lot of confusion about, well, what is the role of British Muslims, and kind of where do they sit in society, and like challenging this idea of their citizenship, which has happened, and we see it from kind of a secularization angle, in terms of kind of laws and legislation that are being put together, which constantly make you question. So you have Schedule 7, which you're a British citizen, but you're Muslim. You can be stopped, searched, detained, your passport, your mobile phone, everything taken away from you. You're not allowed any legal representation just on the basis of you being a Muslim. So that in itself shows kind of how problematic and stigmatization occurs. But then, as I earlier mentioned, like with the Windrush generation, and I think there've been other previous people have commented where there were certain things that were tested within particular communities, seen if it's acceptable, and then it's panned out to elsewhere. So this kind of like with this idea of groups that were hoodies, so young youth that were hanging around in the streets, they were kind of criminalized, and there was a focus on stop and search on them, and that then extends to other communities, and now it's to Muslim communities as well. And there needs to be this challenge of challenging kind of, and knowing and being aware of people's rights and what their civil liberties are, if they are kind of restricted in a way, what they need to do to challenge that. And just another point is about kind of the Windrush generation, like what they must feel, like they've considered themselves to be British, and then their whole like kind of what they stand for, who they are, has just been kind of taken, ripped away from them, and they've been expected to go back to a country which they have very less association with. Now, like with Arab Spring, what we saw was obviously we have a huge influx of issues to do with how migration is perceived and refugees. We've lost that sense of empathy of children washing up on a seafront and seeing it as someone else's problem. Like that empathy's gone, and I think what's happened is Muslim communities have become almost like dehumanized. So they're seen very much as something that you can't connect with or have empathy towards. There's lots of kind of like people, like there's a celebrity culture now which is occurring. So you have social media influencers, you have people like Mo Farah, you have Nadia, who won the British Bake Off, and they're kind of humanizing being a Muslim and being part of this society which they've been born in and grow up in. But these questions of loyalty were very much pitched as a notion in the kind of multiculturalism debate era, whether it had failed, it was dead, and therefore we need to get people to question their kind of loyalties. But going back to your question, yes, I think it has a special reserved place for Muslims to some extent. So this question is posed and kind of associated to them many times. Like even I remember when I was doing my thesis, and at the time, right at the end, there was this the whole kind of conflict that was going on in Syria, and this ISIL and ISIS group. And one of the academics asked me, "Oh, so do you support ISIS?" I was like, "What?" Like, it was crazy that question could be pitched, but also crazy that you can think that we would associate with something so horrific, like which kind of really took me back. And that people ask, and I also feel like it's in a way they ask, and you're having to educate, inform, raise awareness, but I rather they ask, because then you can sit there and have this conversation and debate also. So on both sides, it's a bit like, what? Why are you asking this question? At the same time, Like, okay, let's have a cup of tea and discuss it further.
Proper northerner cup of tea. This is interesting. So let's touch on, you brought it nicely to racism in Britain and the kind of role and the nature of media and academia from your perspective. If you can just discuss that a little bit for us.
So let's see, role of racism. So yeah, I think with Brexit that's occurred, I think it screamed out to many people who are also of the majority that how racism does exist. So I have colleagues who are from Europe, and they don't necessarily have citizenship for Britain, but they are on contracts, and they're thinking, what do? I have to go back, to whether it's Italy or Germany or wherever, and it's created this unsettling feeling and destabilized a lot of our communities, which was great. Like the whole idea of European Union and stuff, the way it was come about in the UN was, post the Holocaust, this idea of never again will we allow a Holocaust to happen. We get all these countries together and we make sure atrocities like this don't occur. But we know historically and presently that these, atrocities are occurring, and nations are just defined around their boundaries and protecting what is important to them based on political but economic motivations too. So it's complex in terms of how people will position themselves in environments which seem so hostile. But then I also think that there's so much potential, because like if you think about it, in the 1970s and 80s, I'd refer to, like the skinheads and the pea bashing that used to happen, where they used to go and beat people up who were, of a particular complexion. People united and came together to challenge that. And I think in the face of racism, there's people that come together and will try to do so much to challenge it. Even if you look in US politics, you have like the Squad, and these congresswomen are doing amazing things. And in the UK, you have many prominent politicians and also academics and scholars who are challenging the status quo and asking questions like that haven't been posed before. I mean, you had, Baroness Warsi, who said, like, Islamophobia has passed the dinner table test, and that's huge. That she said it, but also to kind of address it. So all these politicians are coming together now through works like APPG to say, right, we need to have a looking at definitions of Islamophobia, looking at racism, and looking at how people can work together, come together, and they do things cross-party, but also communities, and they kind of joining together on that. I'm sorry, I forgot your second and third question. What was it?
Just also the media, the nature of racism within how media is showing and depicting it.
So media is a bit frustrating. So I attended online, there was like a webinar, and there were different editors and things there. So it was great. You got to, pose your questions and stuff. And this is what I'm saying about kind of the nuances of British Muslim organisations now. Like, they understand what's occurring, and they're trying to create environments where people from Muslim communities can come and ask questions like, why do you have a hijabi on your front page of BBC constantly when you're showing coronavirus figures? Like, you're making associations that, Asians, minorities, Muslims, they're all kind of like super spreaders of this virus. And, subtle racism, which is, occurring, and this kind of, becoming worse and worse because you have various attacks and on those of different minority ethnic backgrounds. The interesting work of someone like Migdal Versailles, and they've done the Centre for Media Monitoring and stuff, is amazing. Like, they've taken on and challenged and juxtaposed each piece and looked at it and then written it and challenged it, and it's that work that's occurring is really, really beneficial. So sometimes there are changes. So even within the media, you'll notice, like, there's the RIS test to see whether something, when you're kind of being pitched to do something, if it's a stereotypical role. I mean, we have a long way to go. I mean, the BBC drama that showed, at the end, the twist was that the woman was, this terrorist was something that was just so disheartening to see, but it was also, you expect it. Like, even with Citizen Khan, like, really kind of stereotypical way of presenting Muslims. But then you have, like comedians. You had Nabil come on. Is it British Got Talent or
Britain
one
Got
of those?
Talent,
Yeah. So, and then, but there were so many complaints received off the back of that, and it was like he hadn't said anything which was offensive. But yeah, I think it's a slow process, and especially within the media narrative, you're starting to see small changes, and there will be. I think it takes people to come into those environments as well. So you have people from backgrounds who are Muslim to start to inform particular rhetoric and discourses which happen within media settings. Even how news is presented, you have Fatima, who was the first kind of like hijabi on Channel 4 News, and that's amazing. And you're seeing these role models for younger British Muslims of how they can feel they can identify, or they feel part of the wider society. So yeah, and I think even within journalism as well, there's lots of kind of interning of young British Muslims who are coming in and starting to pose questions and challenge particular discourse and write their own narratives and define who they are and how they are within the country they live and were born.
So we've got 5 minutes left. I just wanted you to discuss the concept of Muslim women behind the veil.
In 5 minutes?
I'll give you 6.
Okay, Muslim women behind the veil. Oh, I forgot to mention, I was going to mention Generation N. So there's a lot of there's influences of the new generation of Muslims coming around, and they're going to kind of have influence on they're having the influence on the economy, but also like socially political discourses. They're changing a lot. But now, Muslim women in the veil, what would you like me to say about Muslim women in the veil?
You mentioned earlier how the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom described Muslim women as letterboxes. Then Mr. Bean or Rowan Atkinson defended his right of free speech and expression through comedy. And it feels like these kind of attacks become a snowball effect where it bigs up momentum, where the whole point initially of the offense and the reason why it's offensive is just mixed and diluted with the freedom of speech and the right to, I don't know, so many other things. How do we unpack this, just to explain it to our viewer, that attacking Muslims and Muslim identity, is it part of free speech, or is it a legalized form of discrimination?
I think words matter, and words have meaning, and they have an impact, and they change into action. So you have various reports, both academic but also done by organizations that are monitoring Islamophobia, that most attacks are done on Muslim women because they're visibly seen and they're visibly perceived for attacks. So if you have your political leaders and role models making such statements, it only legitimizes this sense of action of hatred and acting upon it, which is problematic. The freedom of speech question it's a tricky one, because there can be a double standard with that. So if it were the other way round, so if a Muslim politician potentially said something which was offensive, then that would have been kind of dealt with immediately and addressed. So I think it's about who's saying it and from what lens, what is acceptable by who, and who. Essentially, it comes down to this idea of power and this power to play for those who can legitimately and legitimize their position and stance in comparison to others. Now, when we're talking about Muslim women, like, there's lots of work. There's Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. She writes about intersectionality. And so this idea of intersectionality is, you are joined together by, again, lots of different identities. So class, age, your background, your kind of experiences, your language, your beliefs, the ethnicity, all these things come together, and it's unique to yourself. So it's a unique experience that I have as a Muslim. I'm very different to another Muslim woman. So we have these nuances that are there, but then how we identify with things as well. So you have Muslim women who wear the hijab, the jilbab, the niqab, and there's these differences, but this is based on how they want to adhere to their faith and their relationship with Allah. So, and what's important to them and what they prioritize in terms of wearing the veil, because visibly you automatically are seen. So you having to kind of, if there is people who will give you a backlash and necessarily say things to you, you're having to constantly explain yourself or be very, very nice and very overt when you're in a setting where people can see you and you're visible. And I'm always having to explain to people, like, I wore my scarf as in hijab as my own conscious decision. So I, and in South Asian cultures and communities, it's like, oh, it's odd, it's strange to wear the scarf for many who are from a more of a less practicing background. So they tend to see it as something negative. So that's not generalizing to all, because that's not the case. But when I wore the hijab, I felt very much empowered and liberated, and felt really that I could, it was something that I felt was really important to me and what showed and defined my identity. So it's a beautiful thing to be able to wear the veil and meet another sister who's wearing a veil and just say salam, and we don't even know each other, and it's just having that connection. So visibly there's that aspect of being a visible Muslim as well. I think it's a tricky one, really. Like with Muslim women, I did a study which was with the IPPR, and I went across the country interviewing lots of different Muslim women, those who had lots of different experiences and different backgrounds and how they defined themselves. And what you noticed about these women we were all different, really different from one another, but they were so confident in what they were saying, and they were so keen to be heard and to be said that, we are our own agent. We want to do things and contribute within our societies. And they found things that were offensive, like David Cameron had said about kind of the English language, and that Muslim women needed to learn English. And then those frustrations were there, but it kind of empowered them further. So it was to almost show and prove people wrong. So in these interviews, I noticed a lot of these women were doing remarkable things and taking a lead and being role models within their own communities, and challenging wherever those negative kind of views were, turning them really positively. But I know, like from others' experiences, it can really drain you to be constantly attacked based on your visible identity. Being a Muslim woman, it's really disheartening, and it can, I think one of the things that we can learn from others who are minorities and the agendas which have been pursued is how there's been a fight and a struggle for equality, and that continues to occur within all circles. So yeah.
One topic that I find interesting, we can look at this personal from my experience, is how hijabi women or women with hijab practice hijab. Especially in the medical field, it was recent articles that discussed the Islamophobia that exists in NHS. Is there anything you can add to that for us?
Yeah, so BEMA did a short snapshot survey which essentially showed Islamophobia within the NHS, and it was staff to staff, staff to patient, patient to staff members. So it was kind of showing a broad range of how these interactions were impacting healthcare professionals. So that was mainly on Islamophobia, and it showed the level and extent of it. A more specific study, which we also focused on, was looking specifically at Muslim women healthcare professionals and their experiences. So one of the issues, and there was lots of issues where junior, say, doctors are being bullied by nurses or nurse leads within a certain trust because they were expected to have their beard below elbow exposed, and trust to trust, the policy was kind of different, so it was contradictory information that they were given. Another thing that was really, really significant within the study that we found was that you had Muslim women who were pursuing being doctors, not following the route of surgery. And one of the reasons was being because they couldn't have, they had to wear the cap instead of a surgical hijab. One of the individuals we worked with, Farah, within the Derby Trust, she and her trust had introduced disposable hijab so they can wear them while they're in surgery. So it opens up the options of following, a career within surgery, for example. But in many, that's not an option. And many accounts we received from various Muslim women was that they preferred to go into either a GP avenue, like that was easier to follow and less to kind of face in terms of racism and stigma that they had. What's significant about our study was that we have had a national change in policy. So NHS England and NHS Improvement have included accepting of headscarves and also kippah and then turban for Sikh and Jewish healthcare professionals too. So through that, we were able to create more inclusivity of those from minority backgrounds and make positive changes that way. But this just shows, like, we've been talking about racism and Islamophobia, and if you think about these women, highly educated, very assertive, many of them that I've worked with are amazing, absolutely dynamic individuals, but they find themselves in settings where they're having microaggression or maybe overt, like a lot of them have experienced Islamophobia, which has been really overt in front of others and others witnessing it, and putting them in really precarious positions of how can they challenge it, and is it something that they imagined, or did it just occur, or do I report this to anyone? Will it impact or jeopardize my career progression? So there's lots of anxieties that they have also within these settings, which I think many do. Like a lot of us in all fields, whether it's in academia, in any type of job setting, there's loads of government reports. So you have the race disparity audit that was done. You have the Women's and Equalities Committee did a report, and it essentially was done and provided the government with recommendations about the experiences and employment of Muslims in the UK. And it's focused on British Muslim women facing triple penalty. So triple penalty meaning their gender, their ethnicity, their religion were all things which meant that they were more at a disadvantage and would face a glass ceiling ultimately because they identify with being Muslim. So it's really hard. I think if you wear the veil or you don't, and you are a Muslim woman and a Muslim man, I think you will have particular challenges, because even if you may overtly or not be visibly Muslim, there are other nuances that exist in terms of how you're discriminated against. So if you look at your job application forms, if you have a Muslim sounding name, that's one of the reports we did in a think tank that I was a director of research for at the Bridge Institute. And that it was all based on kind of influencing policy through academic and rigorous research. So Dr. Emily Wykes wrote about her findings, which were people who had Muslim sounding names were less likely to get employment because of based on the fact of their name sounding Muslim. So that in itself showing how kind of systemic the problem is, but also the connections in terms of lack of opportunity, lack of social mobility, the socio-economic disadvantage that's at play. and if you don't necessarily have particular social and economic capital, you're working doubly as hard as trying to get by or ahead as someone who potentially is of a white British background.
So Muslims, they have the barrier of racism, the barrier of sexism if they're women, and then on top of that, there's the barrier of anti-Muslim or Islamophobia to overcome.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So there's lots needs to be done, but I think there's a lot happening which is challenging it. I think some of the work that's being done by lots of these new Muslim organisations that are coming up now is absolutely amazing in terms of how dynamic they are, and they're using the skills they have to bring about change and change for the positive. And it's not just exclusive to their needs, but it looks across the board. So where other minorities perhaps are experiencing similar situations, they can, kind of bring those up as well. But I think one thing that Muslim communities are finding a resistance and trying to do a lot of work around is this notion of Islamophobia. Just like with the context of anti-Semitism, if Islamophobia is given that distinct kind of platform for Muslim communities to start to term what they're experiencing, there's a lot of hesitation and people are scared to say, oh, I just had an Islamophobic incident. Like even within the healthcare professionals that we had kind of researched, they weren't sure what to call it. And it's not just kind of plainly a particular type of racism. It's based on their religious faith.
There was the story recently of the first hijabi mayor in London, and I think she resigned because of the amount of anti-Muslim and Islamophobic treatment that she received, that she resigned from a position, which is really sad. But the fact that she managed to get to that position kind of gives us slightly hope. I think we discussed a lot of topics. There's a lot of stuff there that for people to go back to and watch again and learn from. Is there anything final you like to close with?
Just I'm an optimist, and I think I'll always be one. And I think there's so much to celebrate, and there's so much vibrancy, even though in these times we're living in, even during COVID, you see so much in terms of Muslim contributions which are occurring and having an impact, which is huge. And I think we should kind of take away a message about what impact do we want to make, and what changes do we want to see, and try to bring them the best we can in whichever platform, whichever kind of avenue you pursue, to continue with that.
Inshallah. Thank you so much for giving your time. Hopefully we'll follow up your work and see what else you try to uncover within British society and Muslims. If you've enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe. Sharing these shows helps us to get the message and discussions, and try to get these kind of important discussions out. Sometimes they're not covered by mainstream media or even mainstream podcasters, but hopefully with the audience watching and sharing, we can get more discussion going on about what's happening in the UK. Thank you once again, Dr. Malik, and stay safe and all the best to you.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
I'm glad you watched our video. Please follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter to be notified of future video releases.